So I'm going to invite our speaker, our guest speaker for today, and that is Judith Potts.
Thank you very much indeed. It's lovely to be here, and I'm very grateful to you for inviting me. My name, as Sylvia said, is Judith Potts, and I am the founder of Esme's Umbrella. Esme's Umbrella is the only charity in the whole world that dedicates itself to people who develop Charles Bonnet Syndrome after sight loss. Now, there are two questions that I'm always asked. The first one is, why the umbrella? And the second one is, who's Esme? Well, I chose the umbrella logo because I wanted to shield everybody who develops this very distressing and perplexing condition. And Esme? Well, Esme was my mother, and it was her experience of CBS at a time when nobody was talking about it and nobody knew what to do that inspired me eventually to launch what was initially a campaign but turned into a charity. So Esme was in her early 90s. She lived a very independent life. She had glaucoma, but in those days I knew nothing at all about sight loss and did not realize how much of her sight she had obviously lost. She was very good at compensating, and she continued to complete correctly the Telegraph cryptic crossword every day, which is certainly more than I can do, and to bake her chocolate brownies, which the family loved, and seemed to be absolutely fine. Until one day I was leaving her flat and she suddenly said, "I do wish these people would get off my sofa." Well, of course, there was no one on her sofa, and I really didn't know what to say. I kind of took a deep breath, and when I was thinking how to react to this, she said, "And there is an Edwardian street child that follows me everywhere, and a hideous gargoyle-like creature that jumps from table to chair, and sometimes the whole room or garden morphs into an alien place." Well, I was speechless, and it was very obvious that the word dementia was hanging in the air between her and me. But she seemed to be all right. She said to me, "The people on my sofa, they do go away if I tap them on their shoulders." And actually, strangely, she had discovered one of the coping strategies. So I thought, well, she seems happy enough. I will go home and see what I can find out. And with the most enormous piece of luck, that very day, I read a tiny paragraph buried in the health pages of a newspaper about a condition which develops when you lose sight. And it was called Charles Bonnet Syndrome. And I thought, that is exactly what Esme has. So I called her, said, "Don't worry about this. I know what it is. I'm going to ring your ophthalmologist tomorrow and all will be well." That's what I thought. Unfortunately, that is where it all went wrong, because he refused to discuss Charles Bonnet Syndrome, even though I had discovered what it was. He would not talk about it. Her GP had never heard of it, said she's got dementia. I said, no, she hasn't, and we left it there. And her optometrist had never heard of it. So I went online and had a little look and found Professor Dominic Fitch at King's College London. And Dominic is the world authority on visual hallucinations of all types, but particularly Charles Bonnet Syndrome. At that time, I was writing a health column for the Telegraph, which actually was all about cancer after a diagnosis I had had. But I thought, I think we should write about this because no one seems to know anything about it. So I called Dominic and I went to see him. And I said, "I think Esme has this condition. What do you think?" And he said, "Absolutely." So then he explained to me about Charles Bonnet Syndrome. And this is what he said. When you have full sight, there are messages which run all the time from the eye to the brain. The eye acting like a camera and the brain interpreting what you're seeing. As sight starts to diminish, those messages slow down or stop entirely. But for some reason that we just don't understand yet, the brain doesn't quieten down, it fires up and produces images of its own. And these can range from bewildering to terrifying. He stressed to me, and I stress tonight, this is not a mental health issue of any kind. It is purely the brain firing up because it has nothing to interpret. So I went back to my desk and I wrote the first ever column about Charles Bonnet Syndrome. And I was absolutely inundated with emails from people who wanted to tell me their stories, who wanted more information, or who were just incredibly relieved that this was not a mental health issue. And so time went on, and eventually Esme died. Her visual hallucinations never left her. In fact, they got worse as she got older and really destroyed the last 18 months of her life. I continued to write, I continued to receive emails, and one day an email came from a professor at a university in New York who told me the story of her mother, how she had been admitted to a dementia unit, despite the family saying that she was perfectly sane. The doctor said, no, she's hallucinating worms and slugs on her food and in her drink. Clearly she has dementia. She's better off there. Well, she wasn't better off there because nobody actually had heard of CBS. So no one was reassuring her. No one was helping her to eat and drink. She stopped eating and drinking with very tragic consequences. And when I read that email, the thing I'd been putting off after Esme died, I then put into action. And in 2015, at the House of Commons, I launched Esme's Umbrella in my mum's memory, with 3 aims. The first one was to raise awareness. The second one was to create support for people who develop the condition and their families. And the third one, of course, was to source funding for much needed research. And so I set off on my journey, and it's been an incredible journey of 7 years so far. One of the first things I did was to look at the World Health Organization and see what it said in its taxonomy of diseases and conditions about Charles Bonnet Syndrome, and it actually said nothing at all. So I worked with a very impressive consultant here, Professor Andrew Dick, and another in America, Dr. August Kohlenbrander. And we approached the WHO and persuaded them that CBS needed a code in its taxonomy. And eventually they agreed. It took a lot of persuading. They refused to remove the word temporary. We know it's not temporary for everybody. They would not remove that. So I still have work to do on that. But at least it has a code. It is acknowledged as a condition in its own right, and not just as a side effect of sight loss. So that was really a big step forward. And then I thought, we need to actually do a little bit of research here. Let's see what we can do. Now, Professor Fitch had done the first piece of research since Charles Bonnet documented what was happening to his grandfather in 1760. So several hundred years had gone by and nobody had done anything at all. So Professor Fitch did his piece of research, and we had that, so we knew a little bit about it. And I was offered a restricted fund, because at that time I wasn't a charity, with Fight for Sight, which is the big research charity. And I collected some money in the fund, and we put out a call for the first researcher. And we got one person only to answer. And this was Dr. Kat de Silva Morgan at Newcastle University, who happened to know Dominic Fitch. So that worked very well. Dominic oversaw her piece of research, which was to try and find out what was the difference between the brains of someone who develops CBS after sight loss and someone who doesn't. And there is a difference in the excitability in the brain. That piece of research will be published, I think, any minute now. So that is very good. Everything got held up by the pandemic, of course. And when we got to the pandemic, it was very obvious within a week that people who live with Charles Bonnet Syndrome were having a particularly difficult time. Not only were there hallucinations happening more frequently, but what they were seeing was much more frightening. And we had established a few Esme Room support groups hosted by local low vision charities. Now, all of those obviously had to close as soon as lockdown took over. But when we discovered what was happening, we then created Esme's Friends support groups, which were all, they're still running, hosted again by local low vision charities, and actually the RNIB hosts 7 now. And they are for people who live with CBS and their families, caregivers, friends, anybody who wants to talk to each other and get that reassurance that this is not a mental health condition, it happens to other people. To know you're not alone is absolutely massive. So what we did discover, and what was actually peer-reviewed and published, was that isolation and stress make CBS worse. That cannot now be denied. We already knew that if you have a fever of any kind, so if you're an elderly person, sometimes they get urinary tract infections, which gives them a fever, that makes it worse. Any other fever, from a cold, anything. And so that was actually quite a big step forward too. And the Esme's Friends groups are still running. And we know, because I was on a group that Jonathan Ward hosts once, and they had been kind of off the air for a few weeks, having a break. And every single person who came back onto that group said, this is a lifesaver. So we need many more of those. I don't have the funding at the moment to do these myself, so I have to ask other organizations to do so. But we have ideas for pop-up ones and all sorts, so that people can get that reassurance and understand what it is that's happening to them, because then the stress levels reduce and the number of hallucinations in turn reduce. So a little bit more about raising awareness. I was approached a couple of years ago by the scriptwriters for Coronation Street, and they wanted to feature a character who developed CBS. And this character was called Johnny Connor, for anybody who watches Coronation Street, played by the wonderful actor Richard Hawley, who is now a patron of Esme's Umbrella. And of course, Richard had never heard of CBS. The scriptwriters knew very little, and I spent an awful lot of time rewriting. But we got there in the end. We had 8 episodes. And after the episode in which the diagnosis was declared to the character, the RNIB and Esme's Umbrella were contacted by 1,800 people. So I think that proves that a little bit of awareness does help. The same thing happened last October, I think it was, when Doc Martin, there was one episode of Doc Martin that featured a character with CBS. And again, I was inundated with emails after that, which is very, very good news. So I stopped writing my health column because I had to devote myself to this, but I continue to write for any magazine or newspaper or online publication that will take something from me. Journalists often ask if they can write, which is great. So we are slowly getting the word out there. And I do know that now it is a condition that is talked about, but not enough. What I really want is for consultants, ophthalmologists, optometrists, anybody really, to talk to their patients if their eyesight is beginning to diminish about CBS in a perfectly normal, straightforward, natural way, that it is part of sight loss, and not to be afraid but to contact Esme's Umbrella, and we will do what we can to help. We have a new website being designed as I speak, a much clearer one to the one we first had, and that will have all the up-to-date information about CBS, everything that we know. I am beginning to find counsellors who have sight loss, and some live with CBS as well, to whom I can refer people. Now, I can't afford yet to fund anybody, so each counsellor has their own range of prices, but I do know that it does help if the person you're talking to has sight loss as well. Helps hugely if they have CBS. But if they have sight loss, then that first step of trying to explain what it's like living without sight is taken care of. And you can get straight to the nitty-gritty of living with hallucinations, which can be utterly terrifying. So living with it is not at all easy. I'm sure there are people on this call who would echo that. There is medication, but it is not CBS specific medication. It's for conditions like epilepsy and dementia. It does not mean that you have developed either of those conditions, but it just happens that it works for some people. But of course, they carry very serious side effects, so it has to be considered carefully before that is prescribed. I hope one day we will have something which will work. Now, we do know one thing that works, but it's not available to the general public. Up in Newcastle, Professor John Paul Taylor did a piece of research with transcranial, I have to read this because I can never remember it, repetitive transcranial magnetic brain stimulation, which is basically introducing something into the brain to switch off the firing cells. We know, because that was a proper trial, we know that that works, but the cohort of people was tiny, so we need a much bigger piece of research, and then we need the NHS to work out how people can do this in their own home. It's probably terribly expensive, which is why we haven't got any further. But if there happens to be anybody from a drugs company watching, please think about that, because that would be very useful. What people tell me is that they work out their own ways of coping. I have a list on the website of ways to distract the brain, because if you can distract the brain and switch off those firing cells by using another part of the brain, that is a massive help. So it's very simple things like reaching out towards the hallucination. I taught Esme to brush the gargoyle off the table just by moving very often, and that means you're using another pathway in the brain. You can dispel the hallucination. So clicking your fingers, clapping your hands, getting up, sitting down, walking around, turning on the light, off the light, turning on music, on the television, off music, off the television, and so on. Whatever works for you, but there are countless things that are possible. Anecdotal evidence tells us that CBD oil is very useful, the legal stuff. Ginger, people tell me that ginger works. Just check with your own medication that you can take ginger, and fish oil. But we don't have anything else really at the moment. But we do have some research. And I am delighted to say that the young researchers who are coming along are extremely interested. Now, the piece of research that was done to prove isolation and stress make CBS worse was fronted by Professor Maria Musiji, who is a consultant ophthalmologist at Moorfields Hospital and a pediatric ophthalmologist at Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital. She is a geneticist at the Francis Crick and looks after people who have genetic eye disease. She has been the most amazing help and support to me and is actually one of my trustees. When I first heard about CBS, I asked Professor Fitch about children. I said, everybody seems to be talking about the elderly. What about children? And he said, oh no, you can have it any age. So I mentioned this to Professor Musaji, and she said, right, we need to, first of all, prove prevalence in children, which had never been proved. And so she looked in the notes of children at Moorfields and Great Ormond Street, and she discovered, I think she said 13 cases of children who had mentioned hallucinations. And no one had done a single thing about them. So she then wrote to all the pediatric ophthalmologists and said, are you talking to your children about CBS? And they all said no. They are now, thank goodness. So she and Dr. Lee Jones are doing a further piece of research to identify the impact that living with CBS has on the child and the child's family. Because it's very hard for both, actually. When you're a child, it must be utterly horrific. I saw what Esme went through, and I can only assume that for a child, it's even worse. So that is a very important piece of research which is happening, and I'm delighted about that. The Oxford University have taken the research from Newcastle about the difference in the brains and are taking it a step further with a very sophisticated scanner. So they are sitting volunteers who live with CBS under the scanner and watching to see what happens before, during, and after the hallucination. Now, Professor Holly Bridge, who leads that piece of research, said to me that there may very well be a higher pathway between the eye and the brain. I mentioned earlier about with the messages going and then stopping. Is there a higher pathway? Are images held in that higher pathway? We don't know. What she has suggested also is that a chemical is being introduced into the brain before the CBS hallucination appears. And I think that is a very interesting point. So we hope that by next year we'll have the result of that. Some of Esme's umbrella money from Fight for Sight has gone into that, as it has gone into Cardiff University, led by Dr. Matt Dunn, who is looking at peripheral vision to see how suggestible it is. Are there images held there? Who knows? Manchester University has someone who is doing a PhD. Now, this lady also did a piece of work to try and help people with sight loss to stop falling over so that they were aware of what's around them. And her PhD is going to be on how do we stop people with CBS from falling over? Because if you are, I don't know, crossing the road and suddenly a tiger is hallucinated in front of you, even if you know it's your CBS, you will instinctively try and get out of the way. Now, you either trip over something that's already there, or as a lot of you will know, your balance isn't terribly good anyway, so you might just overbalance. That will take you possibly to the GP, possibly to the hospital. Neither doctor will know about CBS. And even if you say, I've got Charles Bonnet Syndrome, and that is why this tiger was hallucinated in front of me, you will still probably be sent down the psych route. This is an incredible waste of money for the NHS, has no money at all, so let's try and save some. And also incredibly distressing for the person. So if we can find ways of helping people with CBS to continue on outside, to continue walking, doing all sorts of things to distract their minds, but not falling over, that would be great, because far too many are housebound, and that we need to stop. There is quite a lot of what I call social research. So that is talking to people about the impact that the condition has on them, happening at City University London, City University Birmingham, Anglia Ruskin University, Prevalence studies are happening at Moorfields and at the Oxford Eye Hospital. Professor Holly Bridge at Oxford, I think, will continue on with this research because it is at the Nuffield Centre for Neurosciences, which can push it further into different specialties. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we can get the funding to continue on with that. I think my favourite piece of research is being done by a very tiny cockapoo who Bhavini will have met at the House of Commons when I had a reception for the researchers. This tiny little dog has the most amazing ability to smell. All dogs have great noses, but this particular little one works for the medical detection dogs. I'm sure you've heard of these dogs. They are ones that sniff cancer better than any human test can do. They are also alert dogs for conditions like epilepsy, diabetes, Addison's disease, chronic pain, some condition where medication can be used to intervene and stop some terrible disaster. And the way they know when medication is required is because there is a change in the odor of the person's skin. That is what the dog detects. The dog runs away, gets the medication, brings it back, the person takes it, and all is absolutely fine. So when I discovered that a guide dog is warning her owner before his hallucination episode starts, I thought that was very interesting. And I called Dr. Claire Guest, who runs the Medical Detection Dogs charity. I explained about Charles Bonnet Syndrome and I said, do you think this dog can do this? Yes, she said immediately, because there is a change in the odor of the skin caused by a chemical being introduced into the brain. So those two pieces of research, Oxford and the Medical Detection Dogs, I hope will provide us with a big answer about the chemical. Obviously, it will take some time for the dog to be trained and to discover what the odor is, but it's marvelous that they have agreed to do it. So I am delighted. The last piece of research that I want to highlight is very recent. And there is a charity called Bravo Victor. Now, Bravo Victor, for those who don't know, is the research arm of blind veterans, which originally was St Dunstan's. If you're as old as me, you'll remember that. And Bravo Victor is the research arm, and they look after blind veterans, thousands of whom, of course, in war have been blinded and need all sorts of help and support. One of the things that happens to them is they get PTSD. And when I was talking to the researchers, they realized that there could well be a difference between PTSD and Charles Bonnet Syndrome. They looked into it, discovered there was, and so decided to do some research. And the Office for Veterans Affairs, which works out of the Cabinet Office, which makes it government, has just awarded Bravo Victor a significant sum to do a very deep research into the impact CBS has on people who develop it, to make sure that their veterans are being diagnosed correctly. But this is also going out into the community, because the announcement said that this award was given to Bravo Victor working in association with Esme's Umbrella and Moorfields Eye Hospital. So we will be recruiting people to help with this research, not just veterans. And I know that at the end of this, there will be a massive step forward in how we look after people with CBS. The last thing I just want to say quickly is that there is medication which is taken for other conditions that makes CBS worse. And it is always worth checking with your GP and have your GP review all the medication. We know, for instance, that proton pump inhibitors, which are things like omeprazole, which seem to me to be taken by almost everybody that I talk to about CBS, definitely makes the episodes worse and what you see more frightening. Now, what people see range all the way through from the things that Esme saw, from beautiful. One lady said to me, it's like watching the most beautiful gardening documentary. I can see a drop of rain on a leaf, all the way through to someone who has what he describes as horror films that he would never choose to watch. People are seen quite often. If people are seen, they are mostly in costume of some kind. For some reason we don't yet understand. Children, people see a lot of children dancing around. Animals, tigers, very common. Snakes, very common. Water and fire, yes, that is very common too. And that is when the emergency services are called, because people just, it's so vivid and clear that people feel it must be happening. But of course it isn't. And they arrive, there's nothing there. And after a couple of calls, they say they won't go back. So there's a lot we need to do to support people in their own homes. But I think for now, that is all that I need to say, except that Charles Bonnet himself described these hallucinations as the theatre of the mind, which is particularly good for me because in my previous life, I was an actress. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Judith. Just a couple of things, just in case people may not be aware. You mentioned PTSD. Do you just want to quickly clarify what that stands for?
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Thank you. And you also just mentioned the variety of hallucinations that people can experience. And I thought it was important to highlight the conversation we had a couple of years ago. We had a conversation about what I was experiencing, and I never, ever, ever imagined or thought it was Charles Bonnet. And then you convinced me it was. And I said, no, it's not. The following couple of months, I had my annual Morpheus eye hospital appointment. And I mentioned this to my professor. And I said, look, these are the kind of images I've been seeing for years, decades. Is it Charles Bonnet? And he just said, yeah, as if like, I thought you knew that. And I said, no one's ever told me about it. And actually on the letter that your from Morpheus, your consultant shares, it was on there as, and now I forget the word for top shear or something like that. But what I experienced, which I never imagined it was Charles Bonnet, is just colorful flashing lights.
Yeah.
They could be like snakes. They could be like a Catherine wheel, like a spiral, just sort of, you know, colorful different images of curly-whirly snails or snakes or all those kind of things. And I never ever thought it was Charles Bonnet. So they can be literally from that to what Judith explained. So thank you so much for that presentation.